Hello, everyone. Welcome to your newest episode of the Cosmic Matrix podcast with your host, myself, Laura Matsu, and my husband, Bernhard Gunther. And on this episode, we are going to discuss how to raise your level of consciousness. So the process of awakening ties into this topic of raising your level of consciousness. It also ties into the process of individuation and what we often refer to as soul embodiment. So the more you're living from your essence, your true self, and not the wounded and conditioned ego part of yourself, the higher your level of consciousness, which not only affects your everyday life, but also determines how you experience reality. It can also affect your health, your relationships. Pretty much every aspect of your life is affected by your level of consciousness. So in this episode, we're going to discuss how to raise your level of consciousness in practical terms and also become more aligned with your true self as a result. We'll be using David Hawkins' map of consciousness along with other teachings, focusing also especially on the somatic psychology aspect of it as well in the first hour. But the foundation is going to be David Hawkins' map of consciousness, which we'll use as a model to explore this topic in more depth. We'll also share the major signs that you might be caught in a lower state of consciousness and are out of integrity, and also signs that you embody higher states of consciousness. We'll also talk about how these different levels of consciousness manifest in society and different ideologies that are rampant today and how that could affect you. We're also going to explore the somatic aspect of raising your level of consciousness. So how does body tension and unprocessed emotions negatively affect your level of consciousness? And how can we use awareness of this in order to raise ourselves to a higher level? We'll also give you some practical tools and suggestions on how to work with these concepts. And in the second hour, for those who are new to our podcast, we always have a second hour for members. If you want to join us and sign up to the second hour, I think it's about $11 a month. You can go to veilofreality.com/membership. We will go deeper into the spiritual science of this and address where your thoughts really come from, how your level of consciousness determines the field and experiences you attract. We're also going to talk about how certain states of consciousness, and especially negative emotional states that are predominant within us, can facilitate illness, and how positive emotions tend to cure illness, and why it's important to be discerning who you surround yourself with and what media you consume. We'll also talk about this subject of kenosis and the process of self-emptying in relation to raising your consciousness. And we're also going to talk about the esoteric concept of A and B influences, which is basically influence that can help support you and influences that could drain you, which is very important to understand in this age. And also, really, one of the fundamental concepts is that a willingness to surrender to God unconditionally is one of the easiest ways that we can access higher levels of consciousness. And we'll close up with discussing that topic. But before we go into it, we just want to make a quick announcement. Number one, if you're interested in our 14-week group coaching program, Time of Transition, Embodied Soul Awakening, we're currently in a program right now. However, you can always sign up to the waiting list at timeoftransition.com.
The Time of Transition.
Thetimeoftransition.com, sorry. So thetimeoftransition.com, and we will notify you whenever we open up. And secondly, if you enjoy this podcast, we would really appreciate for you to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. So you can just go onto that on your phone or on your computer, leave us a review. You can leave us a rating, or if you want, you could also leave us a little message letting people know what you get out of this podcast, how it's helping you. It really helps us also climb up the algorithm and helps more people find us.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the great introduction. This is a very fascinating topic, this episode, and so I'm very excited about it. Very important in this day and age to understand, because in this awakening process, it is all about raising consciousness. And there are many ways to raise consciousness or to lower consciousness. There's also spiritual bypassing, when a lot of people overestimate their level of consciousness and all these things. But the work by David Hawkins is really fascinating in this regard. And his model or his map of consciousness is probably one of the only in-depth spiritual scientific research out there that maps out different levels of consciousness and how you move in between them, even over lifetimes. So we just give a brief overview of this. If you want to learn more about it, especially how he has developed this map of consciousness and really understanding in depth his work, I recommend his book, Power versus Force, starting with that. Also for visual, I'll have this map of consciousness posted in the show notes of this episode, so you can find it or check it out, or you can also Google it. And also I wanted us to know this is one model out of many, right? So you don't want to make a dogma out of it or see everything just through that lens. But it really correlates to many other spiritual traditions, or even similar to evolutionary astrology, that shows different levels of development based on soul evolution. Really.
And I want to also point out that some of the fundamental concepts is confirmed in some very well-known Vedic teachings as well. It's not just,
exactly.
There's correlations in other teachings that have said it in different words.
And David Hawkins had his own spiritual experiences within that as well. So it's not just a mental approach. But in a nutshell, the map of consciousness calibrates consciousness based on a logarithmic scale from 1 to 1,000 using kinesiology. And again, in the way he has done it, calibrated, you need to also have a certain level of being, a certain level of consciousness to accurately use kinesiology without your own bias or conditioning coming through. That's on the side note. But the lowest level of consciousness indicates the lowest level of consciousness of life, which is bacteria and cells, right? And the highest level of consciousness is 1,000, which is the highest level of consciousness attainable by humans. And that's manifested in the great avatars of our ages, be it Jesus, Buddha, Krishna, and so on. So it's important to know that it is a logarithmic scale, which means basically unlike a linear scale where each unit of distance corresponds to the same increment, on a logarithmic scale, each unit of length is a multiple of some base value raised to a power and corresponds to the multiplication of the previous value in the scale by the base value. What that means, in a nutshell, is when you're in lower states, it's easier to move up from one lower to a little bit higher. But the higher you get, the harder it will be to move up. So the difference between from 10 to 50, right, is easier to transcend than levels from 500 to 540, for example.
Yeah, and it would be good if you would say the word. So moving from shame, which is at 20, to courage, which is a critical level, 200, courage is at 200, is easier than moving from courage to love, actually.
Correct, exactly. Well said. So speaking of it, so there's a critical level 200, which he talks about. That really determines truth versus falsehood. Below 200 is mostly falsehood, mostly non-integrity. And the states below 200, he coined these levels starting on the lowest level with shame, guilt, apathy, going up to grief, fear, desire, anger, up to pride, right? And the emotions associated with it are really humiliation, blame, despair, regret, victimization, anxiety, craving, hate, and so on. Really low states. And also, just to point out right away, not to mistake that this map of consciousness shows levels of consciousness. And they have certain emotional states, but we all move up and down. These emotions, they don't define your base level.
Yeah, so that's a really important part, that he's really pointing out a predominant emotional state. So temporarily feeling fear because a car is about to hit you is different than waking up in fear, seeing everything through the lens of fear, seeing everything through the lens of the world is a dangerous place, I'm not safe, being in that survival mode. So he's talking about a predominant way that you relate to the world, essentially.
Exactly. So in his research, he has determined that 85% of the people in the world are below 200 and only 15% are above 200. In the US, it's about 50-50. 50% are above 200, 50% are below 200.
When he calibrated this.
That was 2002 or
in the 2000s.
In the 2000s, yeah.
Early 2000s.
So, as we just noted, the critical threshold to cross is courage, which is at 200. So it's getting over pride to courage. But most people lack courage. Not just courage in the outside world and getting out of your comfort zone, but also the courage to face yourself and stop lying to yourself, to take full self-responsibility. And the key threshold to break through, to go above 200 towards courage, is pride. And pride is what keeps most people stuck below 200. It's really a childish, regressive state that keeps the self or ego inflated, feeling entitled, and living in justified victim consciousness.
So
right?
blaming
Constantly
the world for how you are and not accepting your choice to change situations.
Exactly. And as we just hinted at, existing on the baseline of above 200 doesn't necessarily imply that you won't experience lower states of negative feelings anymore, right? Yes, as you embody higher states of consciousness and go higher on levels, even to spiritual levels, which are very rare, you will experience these lower states less and less until you have totally transcended them. However, if your baseline is above 200, it just means that the lower states, the lower emotions, as Laura just defined, you have anger, sadness, grief comes up, it's life, but they don't define you. You won't get stuck there and can process them more quickly. Mm-hmm. On the flip side, people existing below 200 can have flashes of above 200, yes, but they're usually very transitory. The gravitational pull then of the lower states will pull them down again, until basically suffering finally teaches them to stop blaming the outside world and stop wallowing both in self-pity or pride and take responsibility to transmute these lower states via conscious inner work. And this, happens over lifetimes, not just one life. Now, as you move up, also very important to understand, as you move up on the map of consciousness or have integrated and embodied higher levels of consciousness, more to the spiritual realm, which is the level above, towards 500, you move from a fragmented perception of the world stuck in linearity to a more unified non-linear vision. Now, that's very hard to understand for the mentalized mind, but what it means that reality and the way you perceive the world becomes more undifferentiated, not divided, diffused, less stuck in the dualities of either or black and white, good or bad, but everything, you see the holistic nature of everything on a spectrum. And then that life then becomes a way of being, and ultimately it's about seeing the divine in all on levels of 500 and above. And there's another critical level to pierce through. It's around the highest level of the mind is 400. It's reason and understanding. But at the same time, Hawkins pointed out, and that's mirrored in all the esoteric traditions, Sri Aurobindo talked about it, even the Vedas, that the mind, the intellect is a barrier to really embody, experience higher states of consciousness of nonlinearity. So that then takes tremendous work or many lifetimes and karmic lessons to transcend the mind as well, specifically. So the critical level for absolute spiritual realization is going above 500, where unconditional love is at 540 in his model. And I also want to say, it's easy to get hung up on the numbers and intellectualize the process, right? It's really important to understand that this map of consciousness correlates really to what many spiritual traditions have conveyed in their own words as well as many psycho-spiritual modalities in the context of the evolution of consciousness. For example, let's take one example. Many people know that we talk a lot about Sri Aurobindo's work of integral yoga. And he coined this higher divine force, the supramental consciousness, which also in the world implies supramental, which means going beyond the mind, above 500. The supermind, as he calls it, that is also attempting to anchor itself on the earth and the people receptive to it. It's a process of spiritualizing body, mind, and life, not to escape the world, but to spiritualize it. So when you correlate this to the map of consciousness, you could say that the supramental consciousness is only fully accessible to people who are above 500 based on Hawkins' map, which is not very many people in the world concurrently. Back when he calibrated this map around the 2000s, only 4% of humanity are above 500, with only 0.4% at 540. There are even fewer above 600, according to his calibrations in 2006. Only 6 sages and mystics on this planet calibrate at 600, and only 3 between 6 and 700, and 2 between 800 and 1,000. They're probably somewhere in the Himalayas, no? Hiding out. But again, it's just really fascinating to really see this map of consciousness in terms of your own process, right? So let's look more into specifically of signs maybe that you're caught in lower states of consciousness and are out of integrity, and how to get out of it and how to really embody higher states of consciousness.
Yeah. So first of all, I would really stress the importance of having the awareness of how you feel, of how you're thinking, of how you're perceiving the world, and being able to be really honest with yourself. Because I don't know if you ever meet people and you be like, you can tell that they're really angry. Like, I'm not angry, so you want to, the critical thing is also having the emotional intelligence and cognitive intelligence, or awareness rather, to be aware of your feelings, your thoughts about those feelings, etc. So when you're below 200, which is that critical level we talked about, the predominant states are rooted in shame, guilt, blame, despair, grief, regret, anxiety, fear, craving, desire, hate, anger, pride, scorn, contempt. And what's very interesting is he also has a separate category on some of the maps of consciousness. If you look up the ones that we're using, I think Bernhard's going to link to the one that we're referring to in the show notes. But we also view God a certain way, depending on the level of consciousness. So we will see God as disdainful, vengeful, vindictive, despising, condemning. We'll see him as very hateful instead of loving when we're below 200. So not only our view of God, our view of ourselves, our view of the world is really seen through this very negative orientation. And, moving from these higher to lower states really involves some inner work.
Lower to higher.
Lower to higher states. Yeah, sorry. I'm going to talk about some practical tools because David Hawkins pointed at a really important truth that we can't just think our way out of it. It's not just repeating positive mantras. It's actually being with what we're experiencing with full acceptance and allowing ourselves to fully experience whatever we're feeling, whether it's guilt, anger, shame, etc., and let it go, essentially. So you can't go into this through denial. You can't go in through this for spiritual bypassing. You have to do it through full acceptance of what you're actually feeling. So if I'm feeling fear, I can't just be like, I feel love, I feel love. I need to actually fully allow myself to experience that fear without resistance, which will allow me to let it go. And the easiest way to raise your consciousness is take full self-responsibility for your experience. So not blaming anyone or anything or any world condition for how you're feeling, rather taking responsibility for your experience. And then, watch, like, I know that I'm kind of need to do some psycho-emotional work if I'm complaining a lot, if I'm being really critical of myself or others, or I only tend to see the bad in the world, like, oh my God, the world is going to shit, everyone sucks, the world is not safe, I'm not safe, You really can tell through this negative orientation, and it's really rooted in survival, is what he also pointed out. I would also say it could be a sign you're in fight, flight, or freeze as well. So having that somatic awareness and awareness of what you're feeling. And it's also important to not beat yourself up if you're experiencing these feelings. The gateway out is full acceptance and allowing yourself to fully experience what you're feeling. Actually, to even be compassionate, if you have access to that, to how you're feeling. So if you're feeling shame, can you find a part of yourself that can be compassionate? If you're feeling grief, can you find a part of yourself that can be compassionate? Because compassion and forgiveness is key, rather than just being even more negative and then going into guilt and shame because you're experiencing a negative emotion. And, a lot of it also has to do with childhood, certain ways of conditioning, certain inner critic parts, certain personality traits that we may have developed as mechanisms to survive certain experiences. So we can also do different psycho-spiritual work, maybe get in touch with these different parts of ourselves, especially if there's a really grief-ridden part or a really angry part. We can use all the tools we've talked about on all the other podcasts to work with these parts. But what it really comes down is to have full acceptance of how you're feeling, allowing yourself to fully be with and experience that feeling, and then let it go. Because what we try to do, and I just want to add on to this, we either deny how we're feeling or we aggressively try to change it. And so there's something about the full acceptance, like, it's okay that I feel this sadness. I'm going to allow myself to feel this sadness. As I breathe into this sadness, I'm letting go of this sadness. It's much more powerful than I shouldn't be sad. I need to change this. So we really need to also focus on our approach towards those negative feelings. And then signs that you're embodying a higher states of consciousness. So, it's really also seeing life as having essential meaning and purpose. So if you encounter obstacles, crisis, even a major illness, to really engage with it fully with courage. It also helps if you have an inner aspiration to the divine and develop certain attitudes that are a reflection of that. So compassion, forgiveness, surrender is a really high calibration. I think it was like in the 700s or above. So surrender to God, meaning like accepting that everything is happening to you is happening for a reason. And if you have the courage to face that, then you can learn that lesson. And it's not meaningless, basically, which is basically the mindset of nihilism. It's also taking responsibility for your action. Here's a quote from David Hawkins about this. That says it really well. He says, to take responsibility for one's own actions and their consequences is in itself extremely powerful and almost instantly raises one's calibrated level of consciousness to over 200. An extremely valuable insight that is learned by all spiritually evolved persons in the course of their development is seeing one's personal consciousness as a decisive influence that determines all that occurs in one's life. Mm-hmm. So I just want to quickly touch on this because I can give a personal example. So I'm sure people listen to the podcast. I had extreme problems with addiction in my 20s. And the way that I had to overcome that, because I was very stuck in a victimhood state of consciousness, is I was also buying a lot of woke ideology. Oh my God, it's just oppressed, it's white privilege, it's white supremacy, all of that nonsense. And there was a critical state where I just had to accept complete responsibility. I couldn't blame my parents anymore. I couldn't blame anyone around me for how, I would say, far my life had fallen because of the addiction. I had to accept complete responsibility for my body, my mind, my spirit, my emotional state. And that really started to reverse everything in my life. So I couldn't blame anyone for the way I was. I couldn't say, oh, it's the government's way, or we're a trauma-based society. I had to accept full responsibility and do what I could to heal. And I have to say that decisive moment of accepting full responsibility for my circumstances is when my life totally turned around. And that's what he points at, is that we reverse our energy field from a contracted state to an expansive state the moment we take full self-responsibility. So it doesn't mean that you're the ultimate designer of everything that happens in life. That's actually God. But it means that you have full responsibility on how you respond to the situations that have karmically been set up for you. So virtues that will help you move above 200 are being considerate, balanced, nuanced, cordial, decent, dependable, diligent, ethical, fair, faithful, firm but also flexible, genuine, hardworking, helpful, honest, honorable, humble, kind, loyal, open, orderly, patient, persistent, positive, protective, reliable, respectful, responsible, having a sense of humor, being sensible, stable, and supportive. So this is just the kind of mindset, is that we really start to say yes to life. We approach it with a certain optimism. And intention is very powerful. So having the intention to really even make our lives better, to improve, to heal, whatever we're trying to work on is very powerful. And we'll go into that in more depth when we talk about how this relates to illness. And, a lot of this has to be embodied. It's not you being fake nice, putting on a fake smile. It's you genuinely approaching the world with an open heart and with kindness and gentleness, which means that you're not carrying any aggression or fear or anger or any of these emotions in your body. It's coming from an embodied place. So as you process these emotions, it will come through naturally. Also shadow work, parts work, anything we can do to work with these other predominant emotional states that seem to be really affecting us can help us move through these states.
Yeah, excellent. So again, important to understand that 80% or 85% of humanity is below 200, right? Rooted in falsehood, mostly blaming the external world for their misery, externalizing everything, and kind of stuck in victim consciousness. In the US, like I said, it's about 50-50. Now, it's very fascinating. 20 years ago, David Hawkins pointed out that socialism, communism, especially Marxism and similar ideologies operate on a very low level of victim entitlement consciousness. And specifically, he calibrated Marxism at 130. For contrast, for example, the Constitution of the United States of America calibrates at 700. That's an extreme high spiritual level, higher than any other constitution in any other world. So basically what we see, put this into contemporary times nowadays, the whole far leftist or the Democrat turned far leftist progressive liberal types who promote socialism, communism, and Marxism in disguise of wokeism. I have to say, even some people maybe in the so-called truth movement and freedom movement, they're also stuck in victim blame, not everyone, right? But the externalizing of everything, they tend to operate on a very low level of victim entitlement consciousness below 200. And I want to read a quote now from him, from 2006, from his book, Truth versus Falsehood. Hawkins writes, "The inflated infantile ego demands and grandiously feels entitled to and is indignant over its rights and expects to be allowed self-indulgence with no consequences or accountability. Therefore, social structure is seen overall as the great frustrator of impulsiveness. The core of the ego is a rebellious anarchist, atheist, and exhibitionist that expects life to be an endless Roman orgy, including intoxicated abandon and polymorphous, perverse sexuality that permits abuse of the naive and vulnerable. What identifies the core of the narcissistic ego is its inability and refusal to accept personal responsibility, and any such request is vociferously rejected as being oppressive." Sounds familiar? "It feeds off the false sense of empowerment of being the victim and distorts reality in order to be seen as the victim." Again, it's fascinating. He wrote this 20 years ago. "At this point, social discernment falters under a barrage of propaganda that obscures the differentiation between progress and regression. This infantile ego cannot discern the difference between progressive and degenerative, despite history's example that all great empires have fallen by virtue of moral decay from within, rather than by aggression from without. The reason for this is quite obvious. As the calibration level diminishes, so does the level of power. Therefore, the inner strength to survive is lost, both individually and collectively. You have to understand that lower levels of consciousness, especially go below 50, 40, 20, shame, guilt, that's right above death. So the will to live is diminished." He continues, "The infantile ego thus hates society in general, but especially its representative institutions such as capitalism, successful commerce, or true winners and successful people." Now, here's an experience, very interesting, what he hints at, the father and mother wound, especially the father wound, how this relates to the projection of
towards authority,
which we also talked about in the previous podcast. If you haven't checked out that, definitely look into where we address the father and mother wound from a psychospiritual perspective. Hawkins writes, "In the psychoanalytic experience, it quickly becomes subjectively apparent that one's attitudes towards authority stem from an infantile fantasy and experience of which the father figure is perceived as either threatening, hated and feared, or protective and trusted. Consequently, all authority becomes imbued with the projected attitudes, and one either joins and supports structure or becomes a malcontent and revolutionary, depending on the success or failure of the resolution of the unconscious conflict and of the father complex." And he concludes with Marxism, which calibrates at 130, very low, poses perhaps the greatest danger to all societies and even the world itself because of its pseudo-plausibility and ease of propagandizing, which preys upon the innocence of the human mind and its lack of development and maturity in large populations. So very fascinating. He wrote this 20 years ago, and we see what's happening nowadays, right? With the Democratic Party has been, for example, hijacked by this neo-Marxist, wokist ideology.
Yeah, and I just want to kind of summarize. So basically in Truth versus Falsehood, he really warned about the dangers of cultural Marxism. He literally said cultural Marxism. He also talked about how anti-American phenomena could basically destroy America as we know it. And if you look at, it's in chapter 12 of his book, Truth versus Falsehood, where he really talked about there was an aspect of criticalness, which was dominant in these philosophical movements, and that a lot of the problematic issues happening as a result of these ideologies were an expression of envy. So basically this whole concept of like privilege, like white privilege, like, I mean, Jordan Peterson has also spoken about that as well. He basically pointed at it as an expression of envy. And yeah, the dangers of this victim perpetrator mentality, especially related to Karl Marx theories. He even said Herbert Marcuse's philosophy and the Frankfurt School of Relativism are behind the cultural wars that polarize American society. So he specifically spoke about the dangers of relativism, which he defined as the idea that there's no independent, universal, verifiable truth. And you see this, this is how relativism has affected society to the point where, like, a man, what is a man? What is a woman? I literally saw a podcast yesterday, a little clip that said that a male can be a lesbian, a bisexual lesbian. And like, so this is what I mean. It's like when you start to degrade language and the meaning of words and even fundamental truths in this world, everything can be deconstructed, right?
Well, to add to this, ties also in the New Age fallacy that there's only my truth or your truth.
Yes,
right?
And that's also part of popular culture, not just the New Age. But he really stated that relativistic memes, which contaminate academia, so this relativism I was talking about, have the potential to bring down American society. And he calibrated that statement at 490. Very true. But I also want to point out that he rated far left and far right activism equally low. And I'm talking about true far right activism, which leans more towards true fascism, rather than just everyone being called far right. Like if you don't want to take the vaccine, you're far right, etc. He calibrated those equally low between 135 to 195. That's a level related to desire and anger and pride. So he didn't believe that extremism on either side was the answer. Rather, he said that the Constitution that America rests on calibrates at 710, which is basically a level of enlightenment. And he even said that the writers of the Constitution were in the 500s themselves. So this is a really important aspect of kind of what at least binds together America as we know it. So he also stressed that it's our own individual consciousness which affects the state of the world. So we don't fix this by railing on about the Marxist and getting into hate and anger ourselves. We actually fix it through raising our own level of consciousness, which can affect hundreds to thousands of people at the lower levels.
Yeah, very, very important point, because what we just described as an example of the far left Marxism, because that's what Hawkins talked about. But that doesn't imply that the right-leaning people, or even conservative, don't have their own unconscious mother, father wounds. They have it as well. Mm-hmm. And then, because then they can get in their own way into the blame victim grab or just blaming the left.
Yes.
Blame. So people blame each other both below 200, and all they do is feed these forces, feeding off of these projections, right?
Yes,
You even see, you have hinted at that before, many conservative dogmatic Christians are below 200, and that this shows in their view of God as the projected ego of being judgmental, condemning, punitive, and vengeful.
Yeah, this idea that we're born in sin, which he calibrated very low.
Yeah. Based on the Old Testament, the book of Revelations, he calibrated at 70. It's extremely low.
Yeah, so what we're essentially saying with this awareness is very interesting. It's just kind of confirming of how this can basically really bring down America. That was the essential point that I think he was trying to get across, how important it is to be aware of this. Yet at the same time, the answer is the same, that raising our own level of consciousness through everything we're going to be talking about in this first and second hour, reading his books, understanding his concepts, your own psycho-spiritual inner work, etc., is the key. Not going on a hateful revenge tour against the Marxist or whatever. Like, your energy towards this is key. Like, even if I see stuff that I disagree of in the woke agenda, whatever, hating them and projecting hatred on them only brings me down to their level, and actually only brings down American society as well. So we have to realize that our level of consciousness has the ability to have ripple effects on the world, even in indirect ways.
He literally said that the best thing you can do for the world is raise your own level of consciousness, do the inner work, has way more profound effects than you can imagine.
Yeah. So, it's really interesting. So moving on to body tension and how this relates to our level of consciousness. So one thing that he outlined in his book, Letting Go, which I pointed at before, is one way to move through different states of consciousness is be with what you're feeling with full acceptance. Allow yourself to fully experience it, whether it's anger, hate, shame, love, anything. And that helps you move through the levels of consciousness. So it's not through resisting, it's not through repressing, it's not through projecting, it's not through acting it out. And then what's interesting is this is actually a fundamental teaching in most embodied meditation practices. It's if you're practicing Vipassana, you're scanning through the body and you're doing that in some way. I practice a form of Vipassana, which is actually more a somatic meditation where you scan from the toes to the top of the head, allowing yourself to breathe into certain parts of your body, fully experience whatever sensations are there, feel into it, and then let it go. So this is a foundational process, just allowing yourself to fully experience your emotions, the tension in your body, feel into it and let it go. That's the fundamental practice, which is easier said than done. But it's really foundational. And people really underestimate how much these unprocessed emotions can affect your state of mind. So when you're really black-pilled and negatively orientated, you're going to see the world through a very negative place. You're going to see the world as evil, not safe, hostile. And that's actually going to be an expression of what you're carrying within your own body. Whereas when you feel loving towards the world, when you feel like the world is a safe place, when you feel open towards it, that's an expression of the openness of the body. So, David Hawkins really said that whenever you're feeling a strong emotion, it's really important to allow yourself to fully experience that without resistance and then exhale, let it go. And we have all sorts of defenses in place that prevent us from doing it. Mainly, what happens is that when an emotion comes up, we have one of a few choices. We can repress it, which I think everyone does to some extent. So we avoid it. We go on social media. We distract ourselves. We think of something else. We can get lost in the head and we get caught in what Buddhism calls discursive thinking. So we just our mind is all over the place, or we project it and act it out. So we're angry, and then we cause a conflict with someone that we're in relationship with. That's how we act it out. Or we can allow ourselves to experience it fully. So what we're pointing at is that the way out and the way through moving through states of consciousness is allowing yourself to experience those emotions fully, which is how you resolve karma, especially how you resolve karma held in the body. And I also want to point out that what I've noticed in my own practice, I've been doing somatic meditation for, since 2014. So like 10 years now. What many humans develop is literally a backlog of unprocessed emotions. And it's this unprocessed emotions that eventually turns into illness and disease. And it can go really deep, which is why I really think that having a daily practice to get into your body, to feel what you're feeling is really essential. Especially if you're going through something big in your life, an illness, a crisis, etc. But in general, so when you first do any somatic work or embodiment work, you could have emotions from decades ago, years ago, that come up and are asking to be experienced in full presence. Because the heavier the body gets, the more we turn to addictions, coping mechanisms. And then eventually what happens is it turns into depression, not knowing what we're feeling, freeze states, which is related to depression. So the more we carry in our body, the more we actually start to check out. And that's at the point where we don't actually know what we're feeling anymore. We just feel heavy, depressed, uncomfortable. So that's just a backlog of emotions. So we need to learn how to process those emotions and tension in the body, which is why actually yoga was recommended before meditation, because yoga helps you get into the body, move through some of the chronic tension, and then allows you to still the mind easier. So the more that you can be with what you're carrying in your body, the more the weight you carry lightens, and the more that you raise your level of consciousness. And you'll notice, because you'll start to feel more calm, more loving, more open, more optimistic, more present. You won't need constant distractions. It will be easier to just be present with yourself as you are. Because the more that you're reaching for stuff like distractions, I need this, I need that, the more there's usually something in your body that you're avoiding feeling. So this is really a fundamental practice that he outlined, that also many spiritual teachers outlined. I think we've heard it all again and again, like the importance of feeling your feelings. And this is really essential in order to practically work with what he's saying, to really get into our body and use body-mind practices to process these emotions.
Excellent. Yeah, just to give on that note to what Laura just shared, summarized a little bit, or some practical suggestions, right? So obviously get into your body somatically, meaning conscious in your body, just not just mindlessly working out, but feel your feelings within your body. Conscious stretching, conscious yoga, qigong, many other body-mind practice that really help you to explore your inner world, right? Via feeling and releasing tension consciously. You will actually sometimes experience when you release certain tension in your body consciously, it will result in an emotion coming up, even a quote-unquote negative emotion, be it mostly a sadness, maybe grief, maybe anger. And it's important then to allow yourself to feel all the feelings, but as we said, without analyzing them, don't get the mind involved, don't try to change them.
Yeah, and
don't resist the urge to project, don't blame others, or escape into the head, into a story.
Yes, that's really important. So when an emotion comes up, there can be a part of our mind that will immediately launch into a storyline. So I'm feeling this because of this happened. I'm feeling this, or maybe you ask yourself questions. Why am I feeling this way? Why is this like this? It's just to be with that feeling with full acceptance. Even he goes beyond that, which is also a fundamental practice in Buddhism, go beyond the labeling of the emotion, which I have to say is easier said than done. It's actually easier to start with just allowing yourself to be with the emotion. But then beyond that, it's also just being with the sensations rather than even labeling it. Because when we have a feeling, our mind automatically launches into a story, and that's distracting us away from the body and just being with the experience in full presence. It's like such a mechanical thing. So we sometimes need to train ourselves, if we go off into a storyline, to bring ourselves back to the body again and be with it with presence.
Exactly. And then also, before even trying to change anything in your behavior, in yourself, first really observe yourself, kind of establish the impartial witness, and just notice, without trying to change anything, your habitual way of behaving, thinking, and reacting. For example, do you notice yourself being more negatively oriented? Do you tend to complain a lot right away? Or do you blame? Maybe do you tend to gossip or talk or think about others a lot? Do you tend to worry easily? Just, being aware of it already initiates some change. Now, one of the important key ingredients, according to David Hawkins, is also not to take yourself so seriously, which means letting go of pride, right? The key level to go above 200. He even says, if you feel like shitty, have a tantrum, right? Throw yourself on the ground, cry, scream, whatever it be. Maybe express and experience an emotion, but not projecting it on others, not trying to analyzing it or anything. Feel your feelings, right? But don't take yourself so seriously, even being able to laugh at yourself. And one important point he made that really struck me is so true because, for example, I talk about transcending the matrix system, control system. It's part of my website's name, Soul Embodiment and Transcending the Matrix. But we want to transcend lower states of consciousness, lower states of emotions and all of that, right? But as he said, to transcend something, you have to first be able to fully accept it first. And in order to accept it, you have to get off the right or wrong about it. It is just the way it is. This is key. Even what's going on in the world, people talk about transcending the matrix. Can you just see it for what it is without seeing it as good or bad, right? To just fully accept it. Or same with emotional states. You don't want to judge now lower states as good or bad, just seeing them for what they are, experiencing them, processing them, and letting go. That's how you truly transcend it, by full acceptance, via non-resistance in a sense. And also what you pointed out is really important, and again, that's mirrored in all spiritual tradition, esoteric traditions, that the most important ingredient to have and develop is a spiritual will to face and take on any obstacle to engage in life fully, right? Spiritual will is different from the egoic will. Spiritual will is not even, like you said, personal. It doesn't even come from your ego. It comes from a deeper calling of the soul to give itself to the divine with a genuine aspiration to the divine. And strengthening certain attitudes that are a reflection then more of essence than a true self and not the ego personality. We mentioned as well, intention is very powerful and affect the field in your experiences. What is your intention in life? What are your values in life? What is most important in your life? What do you intend? Become more aware of that as well, right? Okay, so just to close off the first hour with a quote by David Hawkins. He says, "Remember, while the frantic person flails in the water and drowns, the more evolved person learns how to float. What really frightens people about the spiritual reality is that it confronts one with the reality that their destiny is solely within the power of their own hands. Heaven, like hell, is the result and consequence of one's own choices. Therefore, the key to freedom is by the grace of the given karmic inheritance of all mankind by divine ordinance.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting because Chogyen Trungpa Rinpoche also said that heaven and hell are states of consciousness as well. So very fascinating. Okay, so in part 2, we're going to go into one of my favorite teachings of his, which is how our levels of consciousness influence and facilitate illness and the curing of illness. And I think this is probably one of the most powerful and yet probably to more consensus people, most controversial things that he said. He said a lot of controversial things, but I think it's really important to keep in mind these days how much our level of consciousness can have a role to play in us healing of illness. We're going to also discuss where your thoughts come from and how your level of consciousness can determine the field you're in, the experiences you attract. We're going to also discuss how negative energy fields can affect you as far as states of consciousness and give you some more practical suggestions on how you can work with these in these times. Also, this is not his concept, but we're going to talk about a very interesting concept called A and B influences, which is from Boris Moraviev, which is essentially influences that keep people trapped in a certain negative frequency and influences that can actually help you spiritually and help you on the path. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the process of self-emptying. What does that mean? And then ultimately, one of the most important concepts he talks about why surrendering everything to God and the divine is a very high level way to move through different states of consciousness. And what does that actually mean? So if you want to join us for the second hour, go to veilofreality.com/membership, and we hope to see you there.
Thank you for listening, and we'll be right back.